As many of you know, I've spent a lot of the beginning of this year very ill with COVID. And when I'm too ill to sew, I usually knit. However, I'm 99% certain that I actually got COVID at a knitting event that I went to at my local yarn shop. So I'm not gonna lie, it kind of put me off knitting for a little bit. So instead, what I thought I would do was practice some crochet. So I do know how to crochet and I enjoy the process of it, but the thing is, if I'm honest with you, I just don't like the way that crochet clothes look. Oh, I know, they're really cool right now and everybody's wearing them. And I think it's partly because I like my knits lightweight and lacy and drapey, and crochet just doesn't behave like that. And the sort of knitting patterns I make are usually vintage, often 1940s or 30s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. So what I thought I would do is, to make me motivated to practice my crochet, I would dig out some vintage crochet patterns that I have in my collection and make one of those. And so I dug through my stash and I came across this set of instructions from the 1960s on how to crochet, because this not only gives all sorts of instructions on the type of stitches and how to do them with, very good diagrams as well. It also comes with patterns for 1960s crochet dresses. When I saw these, I just knew I had to make them because they're the sort of really unique, wacky kind of design that I love. But of course, despite the fact that I had my very handy large diagrams to help me along the way, there are always issues with any vintage pattern. So I didn't really want to use any expensive yarn in case this went horribly wrong. And then I found under my bed a job lot of double knit weight baby yarn that I bought for a discount, I think, at the Knitting and Stitching show one year, particularly for experiments. And the reason it was discounted is because it's this colour. And I think you'll agree, hot pink isn't really my colour. But as this was a bit of an experiment, I thought, oh well, I'll just go for it. Because I was working on this when I was ill, I actually finished it quite a while ago. And I am really pleased with it, but there are a few issues with it. Namely the fact that it is completely see-through. I kind of knew that from the pictures on the models, but I hadn't realised just how obscene it was going to be, if I'm honest. It's not really what I was expecting from a crochet pattern, sort of granny chic, but flashy tits. And so while the finished dress fits, and I do actually quite like the style, I think it's cool, I think it's funny, there's just no way I can wear this dress without anything underneath. So the obvious solution to this problem is to make a slip. I do already have 2 slips that I've made from the same pattern here on the channel. Neither of them are quite right, so I knew I was going to have to make another slip, but do you really want to see me make the same slip pattern again? Probably not. I think 3 videos from one pattern is probably milking it. And then I found in my stash that I have this 1960s slip dress pattern here, this view, and it's from the same year as the crochet pattern. Talk about coincidence. And I also have in my stash a meter of fuchsia pink lining fabric, which is the perfect colour to coordinate with this wool. And this was too perfect a coincidence, a blessing from the sewing gods, and I just knew I had to make this video. I knew I was going to have just enough fabric to make this slip, but it was going to be tight. The fabric was viscose and 54 inches wide and still had the tag on from when I ordered it. I traced off the pieces I needed because this pattern was uncut, and if I find vintage patterns uncut, I tend to try and keep them that way if I can. As this viscose lining fabric was incredibly slippery, it took me a long time to cut what was only really a few pattern pieces. Then onto marking up and transferring all the balance marks. The pattern pieces for this slip were similar to the 1950s ones I had made, just that the skirt was shorter. The bodice was lined in the same fabric, so there are 2 lots of every pattern piece for the bodice. I also drew on the sewing lines for my straps because I wasn't confident I'd been able to cut them completely straight. I was trying really hard not to buy anything new for this project, as it was mostly just a silly experiment, but I didn't quite have the right colour of thread or zip. I had a little bit of matching thread, but not enough to wind a bobbin, so I decided to keep that for hand sewing later. I didn't iron the fabric before I cut it out because ironing is hard, so I cut the pieces out first and then ironed out the creases. Nothing was massively distorted or off grain, so I proceeded to batch pinning things together. I knew I wanted to French seam the slip side seams, but the centre back seam would need a zipper, so I'd have to find a different way to finish that seam. I pinned the side seams wrong sides together and then moved on to pinning anything else I could. This meant carefully folding the straps in half and matching the sewing lines. You can see that my cut edges are quite wonky. And then of course the darts for both the main fabric and the lining. Because the fabric was so wobbly, I waited until after pressing and pinning to mark in the sewing line of the darts for accuracy. And here we have the project debut of my new sewing machine. Yay! This was the first project I filmed using the brand new Benina that so many of you generously contributed towards through Ko-fi. So I'd like to take this moment to get all soppy and thank you all so much for your support. I can't tell you how much it means to me, and if you did contribute towards this machine, I hope you get as much enjoyment out of it as I have over the past few months. I haven't christened it anything just yet, so if you have name suggestions for my new machine, leave me a comment and I'll pick my favourites for a poll on the community tab. Back to the sewing. I seamed up the straps, machined in the darts and joined the bodice side seams for main and lining, and then seamed the centre back seam, leaving an opening the right length for the zip. I marked how much I needed to leave open and then machined to that mark, reversing at that point to secure the stitching and for strength. I also did the first round of stitching for those French seams at the side seams. Trying to put a zip in this is not going to be fun. With as much stitching done as possible, I moved on to prepping everything for pressing. Starting with the darts, I tied off the threads I had left at the point of the darts to secure the threads. Then I used a pencil to turn the tubes I had sewn for the straps right side out. This was relatively easy given the slippery nature of the viscose fabric, but still, I was careful not to poke through the end of my straps. I got out my wool pressing mat and began pressing those wrinkly tubes into crisp straps, rolling the fabric between my fingers to get the seam right along the edge. This was fiddly and time consuming, but my only advice really is to be patient and keep practicing. Then I used my tailor's ham to press the darts open. With this slippery fabric, it was particularly difficult to really press out the ends of the darts and avoid puckers, so I had to keep going over the points until I was satisfied with how they looked. I also had to press open all the other seams, starting with the side seams of the bodice, again made extra fiddly by the wobbly nature of this viscose lining fabric. For the side seams of the skirt, because I was doing French seams, I had to first of all press the seam open. But then I had to do the additional step of pressing the seam flat so that the stitching runs right along the edge so I can do my second round of stitching. I pinned the French seams in place, I wasn't risking no pins with this fabric, and pinned the straps in place, matching the markings I had transferred from the pattern. Although the eagle-eyed amongst you might notice I'm actually pinning them on the wrong way here. So oblivious to my mistake, I carried on with the stitching, first of the French seams, encasing those raw edges for a nice neat finish. Then I machined the straps on the wrong way, before eventually I realised that I needed the strap to point the other way, and unpicked it and reattached it. With my mistake about the straps corrected, I could join the main and the lining of the bodice together around the top edge. I went very slowly because of the slippery fabric, but also took extra care over the straps and seam allowances to make sure I wasn't catching anything that I wasn't supposed to. When I got to the points at the front of the bodice, I had to leave a gap to insert the straps by hand later, so I reversed to secure my stitching. However, it didn't quite look right, and it turned out I had actually got my balance marks mixed up and stitched too far, closing the section I had meant to leave open. So I went back and redid that section, securing the stitching before the opening, skipping the section for the strap, and then starting again on the other side of the opening.
I also reversed as I approached the point at the centre front. I knew I would need to clip the corner here later, and reversing just reinforces that area a bit to prevent it fraying. I then leave the needle down and pivot around that point, rounding it out ever so slightly so that it will create a crisp point when turned through. I then carry on with the rest of the bodice as before, skipping the opening for the strap and being careful over the seam allowances and straps. With the bodice now in one piece, I got the iron out again and pressed the things I had just sewn, starting with the now completed French seams for the sides of the skirt and then pressing that seam along the top edge of the bodice. It was a really awkward seam to press, so I tried using my tailor's ham, which did help somewhat, but it couldn't get right into the points. You can also see that I clipped away the seam allowance at the centre front point to make things easier to turn. After struggling for a little while, I remembered that I have a new pressing tool, one of these tailor's clappers from Millward. The handle on the top can double up as a little pressing board for points, which was just perfect for pressing the angles of this bodice. I could then turn the bodice right side out and press the top edge so that the seam sat really crisply along the top. I could have understitched it, but I didn't. I just gave it a really good press and used my clapper to set the seam, and it held its line well enough that I decided not to bother. I could then attach the skirt to the bodice. This I just did through one layer of the bodice, as the lining would be turned under and hand stitched in place to hide the seam allowances later.
So I had a little bit of a nightmare yesterday because I got to the point where I attached the skirt to the bodice of the slip and I tried it on to adjust the length of the straps. Turns out it's drastically too small in the hips, which is surprising because this is an A-line style, so I really don't know what happened there. I mean, the fashion illustration on the front of the envelope, it's quite dramatically A-line, and actually looking at this, it's a much more subtle shape, so I don't know, but I wouldn't have been able to adjust it because it only just fit on the width of the fabric anyway. So yeah, I was a little bit bummed yesterday because I was like, oh, for goodness sake, it's too small. And I was thinking I'm gonna have to do some piecing and put some panels in. But then I realized if I sort of just hoiked it up a bit, it fit. So what I think I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna unpick this seam and sort of shorten it. It might have to be quite dramatically. It's probably gonna be about 3 inches. And then it should, fingers crossed, fit. Means it's going to be quite short, shorter than I normally go for. But sometimes you've got to work with what you got, right? So I'm really not looking forward to unpicking on this fabric though. It's going to be horrible. Time to crack on.
So my little orange scissors came out and I unpicked that seam. I don't have anything against using proper unpickers or seam rippers. I know some people hate them. My issue is that I usually can never find my unpicker when I need it, and my scissors are usually closer to hand, so I just use them instead. Of course, shortening the skirt from the top meant I had to reinforce the stitching at the side seams to stop the seams coming apart after I'd cut them, and also readjust the opening I'd left in the centre back for the zip. I then measured how much I needed to cut off and just chopped it. I could then reattach the skirt to the bodice. As the skirt was A-line, shortening it from the top did mean that the top of the skirt was now wider than the bottom of the bodice, but only by a little bit, so I was able to ease the excess in as I sewed. I then inexplicably decided to start on the hem before finishing the centre back seam or doing the zip. I think maybe I was worried about having enough thread. I can't remember. But what I did was turn the hem once and machine it in place. I knew I would have to finish the hem by hand because I didn't have enough matching thread to machine it. So I did the first turn by machine to give it a bit of stability and shrink out the excess a little bit because of the A-line cut of the skirt. I then pressed that fold in place and began trimming the frayed edges of the hem. Having made the skirt much shorter, I needed to save as much length as possible by doing a narrow hem. So when it came to doing the second hem fold, I folded along my stitching line and pressed the hem in place, shrinking out the excess as I went with the iron. I then had to press the seam allowance of the skirt up into the bodice so that they would be encased by the lining. And I've just realised why I did the hem before the zip. I needed to hand sew this seam in place before the zip, and I wasn't sure I'd have enough matching thread to do this and the hem. Anyway, I pressed the seam allowance up into the bodice and then turned under the seam allowance of the lining, smoothing the lining down so that everything matched nicely and the lining didn't roll around to the right side of the neckline. I then pressed the folded under seam allowance in place and pinned it into position, ready to be hand sewn. I started hand sewing the hem as this was more important to have matching thread for. I used a simple slip stitch as this helps to ease in the volume of the A-line hem to match the fractionally narrower part of the skirt we're sewing it to. The hem ended up looking pretty invisible, which I was really pleased with. I did have enough thread to hand sew the lining in place, which I did again with a slip stitch before moving on to installing the zip. I was going for a lap zip, my new favourite way of installing them, so I pressed under the seam allowance of the opening I'd left for the zip to match the rest of the centre back seam. I then pinned one edge of the fold as close to the zipper teeth as I could without them stopping the zip pull from passing smoothly. I made sure everything was going to match up before machining that side of the zip in place using my zipper foot. Again, slippery fabric, so I went at a very slow pace and removed my pins very carefully. To finish the end, I left the needle down and lifted the presser foot to move the zip pull out of the way. I then stitched the other half of the zip, starting at the bottom to secure the end of the zip in place, and then pivoting so I could match the two halves of the seam and hide the zip teeth. I could then carefully follow the edge of the zip teeth with my zipper foot and machine the second half of the zip in place. This was the only visible top stitching I ended up with on the project, and part of me wishes I had hand stitched this in the matching thread to be more invisible. But sometimes done is better than perfect, and this fabric was so slippery, I just wanted this slip done at this point. I did take the time to make my own bias binding from the leftover scraps of this fabric to bind the raw edges of the centre back seam. I cut bias strips and joined them together on the machine before pressing those seams open and passing them through my bias binding maker and pressing the folds in place. I then folded the binding in half and pressed that fold in place too. Next, I trimmed the frayed edges of the centre back seam to make it easier to attach the binding. Then I sandwiched the edge of the seam allowance between the fold of the binding and top stitched it on. Normally I would pin these things, but I found taking the pins out of the fabric often meant that the seam allowance escaped from its little binding sandwich, so it was actually just easier to freehand it. I also encased the edges of the zip in the binding, as I know these zips can often be itchy. With the binding on the centre back seam, I just had a few bits of hand finishing to do. Because I had to do the hem before the finishing on the centre back seam, there was an awkward point where the hem met the centre back. I had deliberately left the last bit of the hem open so I could tuck the ends of the bound seam allowances under the hem fold and hand sew it in place. The last thing was to hand sew the straps in place at the front neck edge. I had literally just enough of the matching thread to do this, but then the slip was finished and I could finally give my crochet dress an outing in public without being arrested for indecent exposure. I had originally intended to show you what the finished slip looked like on its own, but guess what? Thanks to the lightweight nature of the lining fabric, it turned out to be completely see-through too. So this very dark shot is all you're getting. But put it together with the crochet dress and it does the job of protecting my modesty and stopping this video being demonetized. However, as you can probably tell by just how uncomfortable I look in this footage, still not a fan of crochet clothes. I don't know why people thought these were cool in the 60s, let alone now, but I decided to do what I always do when I feel uncomfortable, and that is lean into it and become really silly. So I practiced some of my best 1960s dance moves and tried to get into character by saying things like groovy and far out. It didn't really work. But this was a very interesting project to make. There is something about the construction of crochet that is very satisfying, but I don't think I really nailed the fit with this one. As crochet has less elasticity than knitting, the dress didn't want to stay on my shoulders, so I had to add little lingerie straps to keep it from falling off completely. But even then, it still felt incredibly precarious and like I might expose myself any minute. Again, I come back to my point about the way the fabric behaves. It is so stiff and lumpy. I felt a bit like I was wearing a bath towel. It just felt so ungraceful. You can see a little bit more here the effect the slip gives. I must admit, I do quite like the way you still get that glimpse of skin through the fabric of the dress around the neck and arms, but I'm certainly not brave enough to wear nothing underneath. I mean, I know the 60s were all about liberation and all that, but I am much too English for all that, thank you very much. And yep, sitting down doesn't really improve the lumpy effect, and in fact, it bunches in a really displeasing way. And you can see I kept fussing with the neckline because it really did feel like this dress was just going to fall off at any moment. Something I do like about this design is the sleeves. I'd kind of forgotten that wearing bell sleeves is actually really fun, and they were definitely my favourite thing about this dress. But I don't think this is going to be a look I bring into regular rotation in my wardrobe. Still, it was a fun experiment. Thanks for watching, see you next time.